similarly, I think a lot of my work has been about, when I went to Nicaragua for the first time, I was an undergrad. And I remember being, I was like in my early 20s. I had sort of just come into my own political identity as a self-declared Black feminist and went to Nicaragua kind of like looking for Black feminism and trying to find the literature on Black feminism there, and there wasn't a literature on it, even though there were women who were deeply involved in the political struggles of their communities. And so I think for me, part of the intervention that I wanted to make was that even though I was really moved and inspired by a lot of the Black feminist work I was reading, I was also, even at that sort of early moment in my political and intellectual formation, very aware of the fact that the literature was very dominated by Black feminist production coming out of the United States, to a lesser degree out of the UK. We were a lot less versed in the Black feminist literature developing in the UK. At the time, and it took a lot of work to get access to that literature, which was shocking. Like even in the early 2000s, it was very hard to get your hands on some of that literature. And so it seemed to me that, there was something really problematic about the tendency to kind of center Black feminist politics, or like our ideas of what constituted Black feminist politics within the scope of the national boundaries of the United States, and that I really wanted to think about what Black feminist politics in the global South might look like, and how it would be different. And one of the things that I found was that in a place, like Nicaragua, Black women activists there didn't always use the language of feminism to describe what they were doing, but they were absolutely engaged, in terms of the praxis. It was very feminist in its orientation. So what I wanted to do was to take that politics seriously on its own terms, and in the language that women there were using to talk about what they were doing politically and why they chose that language to describe what they were doing. And then also use that as a way of kind of thinking about, like, I think what's so interesting right now, even if you look at a figure like Angela Davis is spending a lot of time in Brazil right now. And I think that that's not just because Brazil is amazing, although it is, but I think it's because some of the most radical feminist organizing that's happening in the hemisphere is happening in Brazil, right? Like the kinds of responses that Black women there are developing to really, we talk about police violence and state violence in the United States, for example, but the numbers of police abuse in Brazil are exponentially higher than they are in the United States, and we often don't talk about that. And so for me, I was really interested, being trained as an anthropologist, to sort of be able to, what I wanted to offer was a kind of ethnographic examination of what a kind of Black feminist politics in the global South looks like that could be useful, I think, for struggles that are happening in the US and elsewhere, right? And really kind of trouble the idea that Black feminist thought or Black feminist praxis is sort of a formation that is only happening in the United States and sort of moves from the United States out, but that there are lots of different sort of nodes of Black feminist political engagement that need to be taken seriously, right, on their own terms, and then we can put them in conversation with one another in ways that I think would be really productive for all of us. So in that sense, I think that it's a deeply kind of decolonial political project, or sort of like epistemological project as well, because there's a real need to really take Black women outside of the US seriously, which I think it sounds like a really simple claim, but we don't. Like we're very limited, I think, in our training in the United States. Like many of us don't speak multiple languages. We don't speak Portuguese, we don't speak Spanish, we don't speak French. It makes it really difficult for us to engage with these other interventions that people are making that I think are very important. So that's really, I think, what I've been trying to do in my work. And we'll see how well I've done it when the book comes out.
The thing is that I sit. Yes, thank you. I sit in a relatively. I'm always excited to be in conversations like these because I sit in a relatively boring field. I sit in the field of heritage and museums that has strictures and structures that very often don't engage with critical theory in the way that it could. So part of the work that I do is always to try and think of what is emergent in a set of, and this is my own labor, what does it mean to think all of this theoretical thing from the perspective of the Caribbean? The Caribbean animates my work. That is how I was formed, and I think the Caribbean offers a lot of possibilities to think the world otherwise. And it is out of that thinking the world otherwise that Black feminism emerges for me as a starting point. And I should say at this point as well that it is not only Black feminists, it is Black and indigenous scholarship that animates my work. But there's another reason for that. My collections are emerging from these spaces. So if one sees collections as both embedded in a particular kind of Western epistemological framing of collecting, but also at the same time providing its tensions and its breaks, then the collections have a multiple and innumerable modalities for helping us to think the world otherwise. And that is where my starting point is. And in thinking the museum as a preservation regime, which is how we understand heritage as preservation, to think care, I think that to think care in any very interesting ways now one has to go to the work that is happening in parts of Black feminism. So that's where it emerges from, on the one side. But on the other side, you know, I'm thinking through this word, this space of what I call horizons recently. What is the horizon of? And that horizon of justice is something that I take seriously. How do we sketch particular horizons of justice? And if one looks at what is happening in Europe, one looks at, you know, it is in radical practice that and Black feminist practice or other radical, indigenous radical practices, that the boundaries of how we understand justice, freedom, equality have been broadened, have been expanded, have been made real to their promise. So it is out of that my interest comes, and I try to mobilize that in the work that I'm interested in doing.
I totally agree. They work really well together in these papers. And I wonder if I could extend this conversation by asking, so in Wayne's presentation, maybe both the law and arts come together, though I know more about it than he presented, so that's why I hear that. But I was wondering for you, for instance, how is law, you mentioned it as part of your talk, but how do law and arts sometimes connect or articulate in envisioning new futures, and the same for the UK? How is law part of the problem, but is it sometimes also a solution? So those were connections I was wondering about. So less for Wayne than for the others.
I mean, I think in the case of Nicaragua, there's, you know, part of the difficulty there is that I think much of the way that Black activists talk about the law is sort of always necessarily incomplete. And so there's a sort of inherent limit to, there's an inherent limit to the law as a sort of strategy of repair for these very foundational forms of anti-Black statecraft, you know? And so there's something kind of, I think, perverse for a lot of Black folks with, you know, like the way that they talk about it is certain kind of like perverse logic, like how is it that a racist state is somehow going to correct itself through its own sort of juridical practice? It can't actually do that because it's sort of, it's foundationally racist in its orientation. And so, you know, I think that what has happened, and one of the arguments, you know, I think the funny thing about writing a book is like you don't actually know what it's about until you're almost done with it. And so, you know, one of the things that I've realized now is that I thought that the book was about one thing, right, which was sort of critiquing like the way that sort of practices of like the making of space are linked or, you know, are embedded in these larger practices of state formation and statecraft. But now what I think I've realized is that actually what the critiques that Black women are making, particularly in the wake of the crisis that erupted in Nicaragua in April of 2018, is that, you know, we've sort of reached the limits of like, of the kind of the liberal political imagination, right? Which is to say that whether you're looking at, whether you're trying to, neither the right nor the left is going to be able to step in to provide the kinds of transformative solutions that Black people require for citizenship to actually mean anything for us, right? And so there's a way in which I think that what Black women are actually saying is that we are done with notions of liberal inclusion, we are done with the idea of the state, we are done with the idea of of citizenship as something that can be redeemed, and that we need a politics that extends beyond the liberal imagination, including the liberal imagination of the left, right? Especially at a moment when the political party that is enacting these forms of state violence most aggressively is a party that presented itself as like the transformative leftist response. And so, you know, after I like got to the end of the book and realized that was what it was actually about, I was like, oh man, I gotta get a whole new literature. I gotta like do way more reading. I'm not ready. I just need to hand this thing over. But, you know, let the reviewers deal with it. But, you know, there is something for me that I think is actually very interesting in terms of there is an artist who I talk about in the work who's a Nicaraguan painter named June Deere, who was a member of the Frente Sandinista, like militante de carnet, they would call her, like card-carrying member of the Frente Sandinista, and who, you know, towards the end of her life became very critical of the party. And, you know, one of the sort of arguments that I make is that her work as a painter and as a poet, she was attempting to try to imagine something beyond that kind of liberal imaginary. And she died, you know, very tragically and you know, quite young, like in her early 50s. But, so I don't, you know, she never really got a chance to sort of fully develop that, you know, vision to its fullest expression. But, you know, Wayne, as you were talking about the question you ended on is, can we sort of imagine the museum as a space of care? It made me think about Tina Camp's work and the ways that she's been arguing about like a sort of politics of Black feminist futurity, and how, you know, it's based on this, I'm gonna get it wrong, but her sort of like interior grammar, and thinking about like, well, what would have had to have happened in the future for us to, like, if the way we sort of imagine what kind of Black feminist visions of the future and freedom look like, what would have had to have happened in this imagined future in order for that to be real? And that, I think, is a really provocative sort of, it's a really productive provocation, you know, because it's like, you might not be able to experience that in the moment, but if you can imagine what would have happened in order for that freedom to be possible in the future, then it opens up some possibilities for how to how to imagine your way there, that I think can be really useful. So, and I see some of that at work in the work of someone like June Deere. Yeah.
I mean, it probably is less for me to answer because my work is so now embedded in questions of the law. I just or thinking about it and what is at stake in that, and not to abstract it, as I said, from these happenings in the museum, and this is a regime of museum practice, and then there is the world outside. We keep saying these things, you know, that there's a cultural institution that seems to inhabit a space outside of the world. But just to get to that project, I mean, that's why I enjoyed your presentation, and thank you for the time I had to run out to book a ticket because we have to go back tonight because of the possible ban. But there is a way in which our practice in the museum is structured through that overlapping conversation between scholarly work, curatorial work, and art practice. And that articulates with activism on the other side. And in that foursome conversation, our project is to try and exactly do that. What is at stake in our imagining of the possible futures? And it's one of the things that I struggle with at this point, or struggle with in my own work, is that, and this is a critique of myself, so don't anybody take it as critique. You know, I now know how to criticize everything. I'm good at that. I'm really good at tearing things apart, of unpacking, they hate me for it. I'm interested in what that kind of scholarship of the imagination might produce. How might we think those imaginative futures? And it is for that reason. And it is not that we should mobilize artists to be there to do the burden of our work to imagine other futures for us. But one of the most interesting part of our work is to, and we do that with our fellowship, is to actually invite artists in as part of our work to see how we can sketch other possibilities for thinking the world, thinking otherwise. In our collections, there are, as I say, there are 455,000 objects. There are more than likely 454,000 otherwise ways of imagining the world. And I'm interested in those otherwise moments, because if there's any reason to keep an ethnographic museum in Europe today, is that those museums, at least in the short term, can help us provincialize Europe for Europe to understand that it is only one speck in the world, and that there are multiple modes of being and knowing outside that we've not come given the place. And it is exactly why that in that way I want to connect with what you were proposing, because a part of thinking with the Caribbean is also, and through and from, is also to suggest that one has to be cautious about how the North Atlantic frame governs our way of knowledge production, but also museum practice.
I agree. I guess for the law, it's been such a disappointment for the black community in Britain. It's let us down at every juncture that we just don't have any trust in it. And we're at the moment where we're currently in that process of suspending European law and introducing British law, whatever that will be. And the creativity has enabled us to make sense of the world, because a lot of the things that I guess the post or the 20th century black communities in Britain had signed up to, all of those things pretty much have been dismantled or in the process of being dismantled. So what then replaces it? If your grandparents came to the UK on a British passport, and you're still questioning whether or not you're British, it kind of makes a nonsense of the law. Or your Britishness can be withdrawn. So we're having British citizens who are actually having their citizenship withdrawn, and it happens a lot. I mean, we know about the major cases, but there are smaller cases where it just happens and no one ever knows about it. And I think what people are doing in that case, and certainly black feminism writing to this, they're creatively thinking about, we have to think beyond Britain and actually beyond Europe. Because it was always difficult, I think, for black people in Britain to get on board with the European project, because it was such a toxic conversation in the UK. And they made it difficult for people to engage in that. Although I think most black people did not vote for Brexit. I think it's safe to say that. But I think people are now, have always been thinking, say since this economic downturn, this last 12 years have been so toxic in the UK on the issue of race, that people have been forced to think beyond the island mentality, because it cannot sustain black life as it stands. So it's like, okay, then how do we sustain black life? And so we've needed creative intervention to sort of begin that imagination, because all of the things that you would normally go to in the state, education, literature, the media, the law, they just haven't delivered. So we've just had to think outside of the box. And some exciting conversations are happening, and people are actually looking for solutions. So it's not a theoretical conversation in the UK. People want practice-based solutions. And there is certainly a mood that will take us beyond the United Kingdom. So that's why I'm saying this trans conversation of translingual, transcultural, transnational, transgender people are really talking in these ways, because the concept of Britain just doesn't really mean anything to a lot of people, regardless of race. But I was talking specifically about black people. It has diminishing meaning, really, and for many of us, it has no meaning anymore.
So we have a couple of questions coming from Twitter, right? But before, I just want to make a comment that I had a question that it can now be a comment because you've raised it, right? Which is this discussion about the envisioning, right, of a future. Because what I wanted to just say was that coloniality was made possible by first beginning with a notion of the world, right? The colonialists' notion of the world. They wanted to create an administrative mechanism that was colonization, was a facilitation of that. And so I think in thinking about what it takes to actually decolonize anything, we have to start with the vision of the world to come and then work towards that. So I just wanted to say I'm glad that that came up, and it came up in every one of your responses to two questions. But
So we have a question from Victoria Okoye, who was supposed to present but wasn't able to make it. And so she says her question is regarding the theme on decoloniality. I also think about, and often, the centering of the U.S. and North American Black theorizing when it comes to our work on Black geographies globally, perhaps similar to centering and the application of Western theory to non-Western locales like Accra. How do we also center this centering? How might theorizing on Black life in Niger or Nicaragua or Ghana also push the way we think about or understand Black life in a place like Atlanta or DC, especially the connections and relations between these places and their people?
Thank you, Victoria, for that question. I do have actually serious thoughts on that. Before I got to the point where I was wrapping up the project on Nicaragua, I began a second project on looking at the politics of environmental racism and energy production in my mother's hometown in Southwest Louisiana, in a tiny little freedmen's town you've never heard of called Mossville. And it was really interesting because I've been asked by people about, on the one hand, that seems like a fairly abrupt shift in terms of like objective analysis to go from looking at Black social movements and Black women's activism in Central America to then studying environmental racism in the U.S. Gulf South. But, I think one of the things that's been so great about having been trained as an anthropologist and working somewhere else first, and then taking those insights and being able to apply them to the United States is that you do ask different kinds of questions, right? So like the way Black politics in a place like Nicaragua, where there is a juridical framework in place for Black people to make claims to land that are not just about making claims to private property, but that are about making claims to territory in terms that approximate something like indigenous forms of sovereignty, is really different, because then you think like, well, why don't Black people in the United States talk about our land claims like that? Like, why don't we, because this is, like the town that I'm talking about is a historic freedmen's town. It was founded by Black people who had been formerly enslaved, who were living in parts of the country that were considered undesirable, where white people did not want to be. They ceded that land to Black people for the purposes of containing them, much in the same way that the Nicaraguan state has dealt with the Caribbean coast. And now, all of a sudden, because it's profitable to the transnational petrochemical industry, now, the state, private capital, want that land back. And so the debate has been framed in these terms of like individual private property, but I'm like, oh, it would be so different if Black people talked about our land claims the way Black people in the global South talk about their land claims, like how Black people in Brazil are organizing as Quilombo communities, the way Black people in Honduras, Garifuna people, are organizing and claiming huge chunks of territory on the coast and keeping massive tourist development from happening in those regions. Like, I think there's something so rich that Black people in the United States, like our struggles would be radically enhanced if we took the political insights of Black people struggling in other parts of the world, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean. It would expand the scope of our political demands and also sort of deprovincialize the forms of racial violence and injury that we're subjected to, which is to say that the South, the South African petrochemical company that is currently buying out my mother's hometown, before they did that in the United States, they were, profiting on the cheap and exploitable labor of Black South African workers, in Johannesburg, right? So I think that one of the things that we can offer as geographers, as anthropologists, and what we learn when we are able, it's an enormous privilege to be able to work outside of the United States. Not everybody is able to do that. And if you do have the opportunity to do that, I think there's something very important that can take your work out of the realm of the sort of the theoretical and the institutional, out of the museum, out of the academy, and bring those insights into spaces where people are struggling to survive in really meaningful ways. Like, those are interventions we can make that are, I think, that are enormously valuable. And that also analytically have really important insights to offer too, because it also just shifts the kind of questions you ask as a scholar, you know? And that just makes for better work, I think, so.
Can I just, and I also want to thank Victoria for that, and just say quickly, you know, and I've said this before, because of my own intellectual formation, and then after being formed in the Caribbean, and then moving to Europe, then that's what I take with me. So in a way, yeah, I do a course each year at the University, the Free University, called Decolonizing Europe, where I invite my students to read Glissant, Césaire. All of them are reading that in the context of contemporary European discussion of what it means to be European. And they're asking the question, what yield might this have for how we think the political project in the present? So for me, that is central, but it is also, so these questions that are going on, especially in Europe right now, as a kind of Europe-centered idea about who owns cultural objects. Now, in my teaching, I just started 2 weeks ago a Caribbean anthropologist who studied Maroon notions of property, because I was interested in what might it mean if we were to think property regimes from the Caribbean and take that to the notion of how property law is understood in many spaces in Europe. How does that change the notion? For example, questions that emerge in South Africa as well around property, squatting. What might it mean for somebody to just squat, I can't say this too loudly, but squat a museum, to think squat a museum that, in terms of ownership, if it's not using it. So I think that there is some very important fruitfulness in trying to decenter how we understand that knowledge production that projects itself. I remember, and one probably cannot criticize things too publicly, but I remember this book, Global World Anthropology. And I think it was an interesting attempt, but having read the book, one still felt that it was a worlding that started in the center, in one center that still projected itself onto the world. And so what might it mean for a real reworlding that sees other centers being more important, being spaces for theorization as well, that have us think differently about blackness, but about a lot of the regimes around which we think today. Can I just say one last thing here? Because I'm so structured in an institution, I think that many of the problems we have is not a problem of practice. So we often say that there must be practice, practical solutions. I think a problem that we have is that the very conceptual framing, theoretical conceptual framing that we turn into practice are problematic. So if we still have notions of citizenship up here that we are discussing theoretically that foreclose the possibility of equity, when we turn that into policy, it still will be unequitable. We need more theory that is oriented to horizons of justice that can be translated into practice. Because right now, in the work that I do in terms of museum practice, actually the problem is that we don't have enough theory. We simply think that decolonization means a set of bullet points. It's not the bullet points that's the problem. It's the conceptual arguments that translate into the bullet points. That's very often the problem. And so this is my plea for more theory.
I have a question, I'm gonna struggle with it. Sorry. So I was curious kind of just about, in a word, lyrical aspect of what I got from some of your presentations. So you're talking about the changing landscapes of Black cultures across Britain, and you contextualize Lovers Rock as an integral part of Caribbean rebellion. I'd be curious for you to speak about some kind of contemporary shifting cultural formations and lyrical moments that really reveal to you these kind of this context around austerity, just a response, those lyrical responses, and also you literally bookended your presentation with lyrics. It was interesting to me. and you kind of having these sayings. There was one saying that was something like the mestizos are trying to get rid of us, and so I was also curious about language and some of the sayings, be they kind of colloquial or black specific, got it from the specific that really sit with you in your research. So just really just geeking out on language right now, and maybe even lyrical black geographic language. I can struggle at that. It came out.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the music has always formed. Sort of lovers rock is one of those genres that kind of people forgot about in a way. You know, I mean, I didn't forget about it, but a lot of people forgot about that music. And thank goodness, you know, Lisa Palmer was writing about it, but so we've been able to kind of contextualize it. But that kind of timeline of the mid-70s, it's quite a long time ago, but it's really important in British history, specifically relating to Brexit, because it was at that time when Britain was actually joining the European Union. And we see how that narrative has kind of played out. And so the music genres that are coming are very much sort of forming or responses to the cultural cycles, economic cycles in Britain. So at that time in the early 70s, we were starting to see the beginning, you know, the kind of deindustrialization period in the 70s. And at that time, so a lot of the music was forming, people were creating this music as a response to that increasing situation of challenges in Britain, racism. And then moving forward to now, I mean, I didn't kind of go into that as much, but the timeline for the music that's being created, so there's a big genre at the moment coming out of the UK is called grime, which is, probably all heard of it over here, and Stormzy's really big, I guess, but a lot of the music industry's changed. There's a lot of politics in that, because most of the artists that you would know of are male. And that's not an accident. There's a lot of politics, racial politics going on in the music industry in the UK in relation to black female artists. And so these artists, the ones that I named, a lot of them are achieving success overseas, so not in the UK, right? You know, so, which I didn't go into, but there are politics there. So they're responding in a separate way, which is why I connected them to Lovers Rock. So they're of the same generation of this grime artist, but for me, they're talking in a way that goes outside of. They're responding in the way the artists did previously. So the music, the mainstream, it's not mainstream. So I guess what they're doing is they're finding, as I say, obviously they're creative, but they're thinking creatively in response to these exclusionary matters. So the record industry wants black artists to perform specific forms of genres of music in the UK. And if you don't perform that genre of music, you can't get signed. And you just don't get signed. Or they don't know what to do with you. That's the other excuse. So, but in that they have the freedom to talk about things. So their music, the artists that I named, and there are others, but these are the ones I felt like people would know. Their music sounds very different to the popular black British music. But it is black British music if you look at the black British music that's been created over the last 50 years. More so than the popular music. So, but it doesn't get talked about. Those artists don't really get talked about. Kind of people know of them, but they're not in the mainstream media. But they're around. And I think 40 years from now, we'll be talking about the artists that I named. Because their music's going to survive the next 40 years.
Lauren Magula will stand the test of time.
She's amazing. It's funny, I never get asked questions about like lyricism in my work about Nicaragua, probably because it's the least artful of the work I've done, just in terms of like being an artist. But when I started doing that work, I didn't approach the work as an artist. I approached it primarily as a scholar. Now I'm looking back and I'm thinking about Nicaragua in very creative and aesthetic terms. But I will say in terms of language, like there are a few sounds that make me happier than hearing Black women speak Mosquito Coast Creole. It's a very specific accent. I grew up, my father's Jamaican, and I grew up among a bunch of like very rowdy West Indian aunts. And I love listening to them talk, and I love listening to them laugh, and I love the way they tell story, and I love the way they make arguments in very pithy statements. That's very Jamaican. And so going to Nicaragua and working with Afro-descendant populations whose Mosquito Coast Creole sounds very similar. If you know, if you grew up on the coast, or if you grew up among Jamaicans, you can very clearly distinguish the difference between the accents. But the origins of the accent are rooted in Jamaica, and so the way they talk, the way they make arguments, the way they read things analytically is very similar. And so like there are expressions that, you know, when you're giving presentations like this, the first thing that has to go is quotes because you don't have time, but like there are things that women will say, like my favorite expression among Creole women is like how you pick sense from nonsense. You have to pick sense from nonsense. Like it's just like this way that they get at the heart of a matter. Like there's a quote in one of the chapters where I asked one of the women I worked with like to describe the leadership of Black women, and she just was like, it was like listening to the way Richard Price talks about like first time, when in his studies of like the Surinamese and like first time knowledge and how people draw from the kind of collective ancestral wisdom of the community. And she said something like, it's hard to see the leadership of Black women. If you have a community way of seeing things, you could find them easily. But if you have a political way of seeing a leader, you would never identify a Black woman. Because it's like how we used to plant in the old time days. That's how Black woman leadership is. Between the mess, the disorder, the struggle, there we is. And nobody see we, only the one with them put up on high stage, them is the leader. Like there's just this beautiful way that they talk about, you know, she would talk about like how Creole farmers would plant things, and she's like, we didn't plant things in like these orderly, neat kind of monocrop rows, you know, like it's a whole lot of sort of complementary forms of planting, and like it's a completely, like from the outside it just looks like chaos, but the farmer knows what he or she is doing, you know, and they plant certain plants next to each other because they grow well alongside each other. They're good neighbors in the soil, you know. And it was just like the way that she would talk about that and then would apply that to her experiences as a political activist. I was just like, this is so brilliant. And it's so beautiful. I mean, just the way they talk. And so anyway, like those are things I think a lot about, and trying to hold on to like just the musicality of the language and the writing and like sharing that, because I think that that's language also, like when you think about sort of horizons of justice, language is a really important part of that, because language is not just a sort of like, you know, we know like language doesn't just sort of reflect reality, it also shapes it, right? Like our sense of what is politically possible is very much shaped by the kind of like the grammatical structures and the linguistic structures and the conceptual structures in which we operate. So it is really important to take language and like how people talk about themselves and about their social worlds very seriously.
I just very quickly by saying that, you know, I was going to play two dancehall pieces for you, one Vibes Cartel and one Wasp. And I play Vibes Cartel with almost any presentation I do these days. And the reason is exactly the horizons they sketch. Or when Sizzla, I think Sizzla says in an opening to one of his songs, he burns Babylon first. And then he says, I'm indigenous. Now, that I'm indigenous is a proposition for a paper, which I wrote. Because that it invited me to write a paper when he says, I'm indigenous. It has so much in it. But Vibes Cartel uses, in broadcasting company, he structures all sorts of ideas about what is order and disorder, how do we understand notions of power relations. In reparations, reparations, that song Reparations, that Vibes Cartel, which is your book, Reparations is actually a call to repatriate objects. It exactly tells us what is necessary for us to rethink the regimes of power and the law that will help us to repatriate objects. So to answer your question, it is in music like that that I find, in addition to cultural theory, that I find the space with which to theorize, to think otherwise, because that is what is happening there. So yeah. I don't know if we have time.
Let's throw a couple of things out there. This is really, really engaging, all your presentations and this discussion. Just two things that just struck me. One thing was just thinking about the museum and the university, and and the black scholar, the black thinker. To some extent, the thinker of color, but really in the U.S., the black thinker as resisting being an ethnographic object, an artifact, and the differences in what it means to make work that is, well, ... The second thing that struck me in this conversation is I feel a tension between until the philosophy that holds on man superior to another, blah blah blah, everywhere is war, that, and Courtney's proposition that the emergence of black feminist political will to take on the larger structure, or the austerity, the museum, there's some productive tension there, I think. Theory, you asked the question of theory, or Jovan about imagining another world, but that really is a powerful global interconnected set of propositions from, I'd say, black and subaltern feminist traditions today. We ignore them to our collective peril, actually, right? Our current moment of danger. Just a thought.
This is something that's kind of been burning my mind. So there's some more intersections I see. It's about blackness and indigeneity. And as a student, I'm struggling with the nuances here, and I understand like the Afro-Indigenous Garifuna, like the South Central American context, the Caribbean context, winter is black metamorphosis. And I'm also wondering about like the Black American context for being able to speak blackness and indigeneity together. And I assume in Europe it would be a similar conversation. But I was wondering if you guys could reflect more about being in solidarity, or citing indigenous scholars, but also like pushing the concept of black indigenous or indigeneity forward, and like maybe help me with some of like the theoretical problems, and not trying to be like problematic about it, but just like help us start this conversation.
Yeah, just that little small thing.
Very small.
Office hours. We can work it out in office hours. We definitely not gonna work it out here. I think, in the context of Nicaragua, it's a little bit different, because I think the political futures of black and indigenous people have always been linked in a very particular kinds of way, because of their differentiated but shared sort of antagonistic relationship to the mestizo nation state. So the way that those racial formations have played out in the space of Nicaragua and Central America generally, I think are very different than the way they play out in the United States, where I think black and indigenous people are positioned much more as sort of competitors in sort of making claims for resources and rights on the state, right? So I think about, I'm gonna butcher this, I can't quite remember, but I remember like reading somewhere many years ago about like a gathering of black and indigenous activists, and black folks were sort of making demands for, reparations, and indigenous folks were like, well, you can keep the mule, but the 40 acres, that's ours, right? So, so there are very real tensions in the United States that I think have made it much more difficult for black and indigenous people to think of each other as allies in particular kinds of ways. Whereas in Latin America, I think the formation and the paradigm is really different. I also think the sort of slippage between racial and ethnic categories in Latin America is really different. So the question of who is indigenous and who is black is sort of open-ended in a way that is very different again than like how the sort of legal categories of racial difference have operated in the United States. And we can see that even, for example, in recent debates over like the status of black people in the Cherokee Nation, for example. Right, like those sorts of, or like the extension of tribal status to indigenous people, particularly like working in the state of Louisiana now, where there are a lot of Black indigenous people, and they are not recognized, they do not have federal tribal status because the federal government is like, you're not indigenous, you're Black, right? As though all of the sort of colonial histories that produce mixed race indigenous peoples, or like why we continue to act as though indigeneity is a racial category as opposed to like a place-based or like a political or, you know what I'm saying? Like, there are indigenous people all over the world. We need not attach a racial identity to that per se, but in the United States we insist on that in ways that I think make it hard for Black and indigenous people to organize politically. So I think in that context, place matters a lot. And again, like for real, if you want to come and talk about it, we can. But I do think that what's interesting right now is where I see some of the most interesting and productive political and intellectual engagement happening between Black and indigenous scholars is around questions of climate change in the Anthropocene, like people thinking about what comes after the end of the world. Like those kinds of political imaginaries, I think, are Black and indigenous people are kind of leaning into each other in a way, because we are in effect the only kinds of racial subjects who have experienced, like, on the scale that people are talking about now, like world shattering, you know, like we know what it is for the world to end. And so that means that we have something really important to offer to these conversations about what the future might look like. And I think that is a space where I see some really interesting and exciting conversations happening that could be useful for reframing how we imagine like Black and indigenous solidarities for the 21st century, right? So how do we remain attentive to our sort of differentiated histories of state violence, while also not assuming that those histories preclude the possibility for new kinds of solidarities that are engendered by the crisis that we're living under now. And like, that's what I'm super interested in. So yeah, come and talk to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, I first of all would like to claim non-space, because it's also hard to speak about the specific politics of here, not being from here. And not attendant to some of the discussion, but at the same time, I want to suggest that in the Netherlands as well, we do see a certain kind of struggle in between solidarity across different groups and a kind of hierarchy of suffering. So that struggle happening, especially around what it means to decolonize institutions, what it means to claim space, have space, be cared for. There is that kind of struggle. And while acknowledging that exists, I want to also suggest that my own interest and theorization, my own interest in pushing an agenda for thinking is exactly in that moment during Decolonize This Museum, the Brooklyn Museum, where the question was not only about race. The question was about race, it was about land, it was about gentrification, so there is as well an emergent in this moment of decolonization, and that's why I'm very excited by what happened with and in the wake of Rhodes Must Fall, that there's something bigger than these hierarchies that is emerging as well. And so my interest would be to try and think through what those coalitions look like, and how those kinds of coalitions, whether in the media sphere or practical happening on the ground, whether those give us the possibilities as institutions, as thinkers, as writers, to be able to write other futures together. In my museum I'm interested in, so we just started a project together with a few scholars and activists called Togetherness. And we're interested for the next 4 years to try and think through what togetherness means when one thinks through different histories of trying to be together with all of its tensions. And we're going to try and develop a practice within the museum sphere for what that might look like. So yes, I see the tensions that are inherent in these practices, but I also see longer histories of coalition building, of solidarity practices, of togetherness that I think we can use as a way of writing other possible futures. I want to say there is a response to decolonization work, where people say very often, but we cannot judge the past with the morals of today. People say that very often. And my response is always, if one were to trace other genealogies of the past, then it would also be a morals of the past. There were a lot of revolutionaries who were saying that slavery was wrong. So if you were to say that we're going to look at this white Western structure that says slavery was correct, then of course you'll see that. If you look at another history to be written that says, no, there has been this other moral economy that was at stake in that past, then that is another story that could be told. And my imagination is when we have exhibitions in the present that traces those other genealogies of revolutionary past into other forms of future. My imagination then is to see what forms of solidarity practices existed where we were coming together to be able to fight the beast that still ensnares us in the present.
I think one of the things that I mentioned was the themes of episodic activism, and I was at a conference or an event at actually Tate, where Tariq Ali sort of mentioned that, and I think people took it as him being a bit dismissive. He wasn't being dismissive. He was just saying that, you know, activism is formed of its time, so the activism that he was involved in, that the young people would not be activists in that way because they're not living in the time, or they're not coming through a time that he was coming through as a colonial child coming from, you know, South Asia to Britain, to Europe. And I think these sort of coalition ideas, I think often we try and we're thinking about how can we recreate a campaign of the past. And of course we can't do that. It's the sustainability, I think, because of our lives are so changeable. I think the idea of running a campaign for a decade, most of the people I know who are involved in activism couldn't think that far ahead. They just don't have the capacity to do that. So what can they do in a 2-year period? Because they may move somewhere in 5 years, they may be in a different country. And those are real issues that are facing people because of family situations and also legalities. They often can't stay where they are. So one of the themes that's very pressing for the millennial generation in Britain is issue of housing, gentrification. This is something that brings a lot of people together, and people are working. They're just trying to work on themes that they can organize around. So they're the big subjects: housing, immigration, poverty. Because they're pressing issues, and they're kind of the luxuries of the subtleties. People can't get involved in that right now. They just don't have the capacity to do those things. So they're dealing with what they feel are the emergencies. And maybe 10 years down the line they can deal with those other things, but they're not even thinking about those things right now.
All right, so with that, we're going to conclude this discussion. Thank you so much. And also, at the end of this discussion, ends our fantastic, generative, and radical in terms of the imaginations and the imaginaries that were produced and discussed workshop. Right? So thank you everybody for being here for these 2 days for, you know, under the threat of life and limb and what have you. But, right, hopefully it was worth it. For people on the internet, thank you as well. And really, I think, you know, ending on the question of futures, radical futures especially, is especially important for the kinds of questions that can be asked through the kind of framework of the Black Geographic, right? Because what we understand is for sure that the future requires a geographic politics. And the blackness as being inherent in that politics, I think will give us the best, most equitable, most justice-oriented future that we can hopefully both envision but make possible. So anyway, thank you everybody. Bye.
Can you just say bye?
Bye. He said bye.
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 There's no closing.